Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. I hope you're well. Join me as we continue to deconstruct the shortcomings of traditional DEI strategies and co-create a vision for more transformative, human-centered approaches to inclusion. Myself and my esteemed guests will challenge the status quo, dive deep into the reactive, supplemental nature of many DEI initiatives. We'll explore how to reclaim the profound and transformational potential of inclusion as a catalyst for collective growth, empowerment, and organizational change. Season 2 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast starts now. Hi, welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. I'm joined today by Darryl Stickel, Dr. Darryl Stickel. I was introduced to Darryl by a friend in the UK. So we've gone from Switzerland to the UK to Canada, and now we're here together. Darryl, I'm excited to have you here. Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast.
Thanks for including me, Omri.
So, Darryl, before we jump into our conversation, I always ask a couple questions. One is a favorite song or movie you go to over and over and over again.
So I love the movie Tombstone. Val Kilmer's portrayal of Doc Holliday is just remarkable. And it's a story about friendship.
Fantastic.
Really, for me.
I love it.
If I was picking a song, it would be Brave. I want to see you be brave. But yeah, Tombstone's probably my favorite movie.
All right. I keep a list of these, so I go back to them and watch them again once people tell me their favorites. One book or person that has inspired you personally or professionally in your life?
So I like my book, but that probably doesn't count.
We're going to talk about that. Hold on to that one.
Yeah. There's a guy named Terry Fox, who's a Canadian hero. Most people outside of Canada won't have heard of him. He lost his leg to cancer and then tried to run across the country to raise awareness and funds for cancer. And we still have Terry Fox Day. People still go running on Terry Fox Day to commemorate. He was a real hero because he was overcoming significant barriers and trying to raise awareness and do something good for everyone.
That's touching. It's particularly touching is, I think I shared with you, my niece lost her leg in a car crash last year. Mm-hmm. And so like to hear that, every time I hear a story about someone who's overcome a limb loss, it gives me hope. So you didn't know, if you didn't remember that, thank you for sharing that, because I'm going to let her know about him, because she needs those heroes in front of her.
He was a real hero.
Wow.
In my mind.
Fantastic.
And is loved by a nation. So
well, shout out to all my Canadian friends once you hear this, and know that I'm here to represent y'all. You know who I'm talking about when you hear this. Now, Darryl, share about yourself, who you are, what you're working to create in the world.
So I have gone through a challenging journey that has sort of battered me from pillar to post. And I have learned some lessons. Sometimes a hard road's a good teacher. And through those experiences and through this sort of repeated pattern of trying to understand myself and try to understand other people more effectively and be more empathetic and be more engaged, I've become one of the world's leading experts on the topic of trust. And sometimes it's difficult for me to say that because there's a strong hesitance in Canadians to be sort of braggy.
You have full license to be non-Canadian in that particular sense today. So just go for it.
Yeah. So I've been nominated as one of the world's leading thought experts on trust by an independent body. And I've spent my life understanding what trust is, how it works, and most importantly, how to build it. I wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. And I've spent 20 years really trying to help people solve trust-based problems.
Wow.
And so there's that combination of deep theoretical understanding and practical applied experience that makes me a little different than most. And, a lot of people are talking about trust and how important it is and how little we have of it. but there's not a lot of people talking about what we can actually do about it.
Sure.
And that's what I do.
Fantastic. So, Darryl, our mutual friend that introduced us, he shared something you said about the structure of trust, and I don't. I'm putting that in my words,
Sure.
but he talked about this idea of trust going from a metaphorical trench that was deep and narrow to one that is wide and shallow. What did he mean by that? Because we didn't have time to dig deep, and I knew I was going
Right.
to be talking to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So part of the challenge that we're facing in the world right now is that, with the advent of social media and technology, there's some great things that come with that. You and I are able to have a conversation, but we were just talking before we started filming that if you and I were in the same town and got to hang out together, we would be, I think, really good friends.
No doubt. No
Yeah.
doubt.
Because I just love what you're on about. And it's so easy when we speak. But because there's so much available, there's a tendency for our relationships to become a mile wide and an inch deep. And so it's easy for us to give up on people if things get in the way. It's easier for us to transition to something new or get distracted. My younger son has just started college, and he was writing a paper on protest movements and looking at some of the ones that have been really successful, like the civil rights movement or emancipation for women, right? They're getting the right to vote, or gay marriage. Those were protests that lasted for an extended period of time
Mm-hmm.
and had a positive, hey, we want equality kind of message to them. Protests seem less successful now because people don't stick for the long haul. And it's so easy for them to get distracted by the next thing that they're outraged by.
Sure.
And so we have, we see this after the pandemic, we have lost some of our skill at building those deeper relationships, those more meaningful relationships. And we need to be more intentional now than we've ever been. The things that used to work aren't as effective anymore.
What would you say are the ramifications of such a shift to this, from this, mile wide, inch deep, versus the opposite that we used to have, deepening trust? They might not have been a lot of trust relationships, but they were significant when you had them. What's the
Yeah.
ramifications of a shift? Because that seems pretty dramatic.
It is.
It's almost like it got flipped upside down.
It really feels that way. And I see my sons going through this. They're 22 and 19. They're young men. And we're hearing about the epidemic of loneliness in the world. And we're hearing about the struggles in mental health that everyone's experiencing. And part of this is that if you start to struggle, I can easily become distracted and wander off. And if I'm more invested in our relationship, then I'm there through the good and the bad. And, we talked about having one another's backs. You've got someone's back if you're in a deeper relationship with them. And you're focused on preserving that relationship and not getting distracted and checking in on them if you don't hear from them for a while. And coming to understand them more deeply because you've got history. And so that's something that we seem to have lost. And we're seeing, the World Health Organization has now identified loneliness and lack of social connection as a profound health risk. And they're setting up an international panel that's going to focus on this topic. I've reached out to them and have started a conversation about whether I can be helpful or not. It's something that I think is really important for us. And it means we lose resilience.
That's what I can say. My relationships have oftentimes been the only thing that I felt was solid. You talked about going through hard times. The relationships that I've had, the foundation of them, that was for many of the people that I really have deep relationships with, those foundations were set a long time ago. And
Right.
and then I also my relationships that are really significant now that reflect those longer term relationships have similar foundations. We spent the time in contact, building together, and getting to this level where even when I'm alone, I don't feel lonely because I know they're
Right.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got a support network,
Yeah,
right? And you've learned how to build that.
right.
And the generation that's coming up now struggles with that.
Wow.
They struggle to build those deep relationships that are going to be there for them when they're having a hard time.
Hmm.
For my sons, I talk about having a relentlessly positive story, and they know I've got their back, right? They know I'm there, and I have a positive narrative about them. And even if they don't have it about themselves, I'm there.
Yeah. A relentlessly positive story.
Yeah.
Quote that one, y'all, because we all need one. Talking about stories, companies have a lot of talk about values,
Right.
integrity, collaboration, loyalty, honesty, respect, occasionally trust.
Right.
Now, I'm not a big proponent of the notion of shared values. I'm not going to do any McKinsey jokes because I know you're former McKinsey. I believe that those things are aspirations and things that we should consider in oneself and others while making things happen in organizational life and relating to each other.
Right.
When one values trust or when a company values trust and acts on it consistently, what do people do?
So we see, there's all kinds of research that tells us that you get higher returns to shareholders, higher employee engagement, higher customer satisfaction, higher referral rate. Like there's just a litany of positive things that come from it. What we see within organizations is people actually having conversations, being willing, because trust is the willingness to be vulnerable
Mm,
when you can't completely predict how somebody else can respond. And so if I'm a leader, that means that I'm actually admitting that I'm not perfect. I actually lead with my imperfections and I acknowledge that I don't have the answers to every question, that my success is actually driven by the actions of other people, that I'm dependent on them to meet my goals and objectives. And I'm clear about the context. So I take significant steps to reduce uncertainty for people. Because for me, trust is that combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. It's uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And so that means that if uncertainty is really high, we can only tolerate a small range of vulnerability and still get there. And as those relationships get deeper, the level of uncertainty we're experiencing starts to drop. The range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And if we think about why trust levels are really in the toilet right now, it's because our vulnerability hasn't gone down, but our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place, right? We think about technological changes, changes in norms and values, changes in expectations. And against that backdrop, it makes it hard for us to be a little more vulnerable. And so if leaders want to build trust, they need to go first, right? They
mm.
need to be a little bit vulnerable first to show people that it's okay.
How does that work with power dynamics, though? Because I know I've been in big companies, I've worked in big companies, and showing vulnerability is like one of those things like, oh, people are going to use it against you. Like,
Right.
I mean, I've never personally felt that way, but I've definitely seen it happen.
Yeah.
so, so how do people manage that, particularly people working at a high level?
Well, you don't dive in too fast. That's one thing, right? On a first date, you don't say, "Hey, how do you feel about kids?" And what's a good time for you to get married, right? You feel each other out a little bit and get a little sense of it. When I talk to leaders about being vulnerable, it means acknowledging that, hey, you know what? I'm different. I'm a different leader than I was 5 years ago. And I've learned things and I made mistakes. And when I was in your role, I made mistakes and it taught me things and I learned from those.
Mhm.
And so it's not sort of running around saying, I have no idea what's going on. We're all going to hell. Everybody run, right? It's a more nuanced sort of look, I'm not perfect. I don't expect you to be perfect. And for us to evolve and adapt, we're going to make mistakes.
Sure.
And one of the lines I give to leaders is I say, you need to tell your people, I'm a different leader than I was 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, the things that make me a great leader will be different than they are today.
Mm.
I am going to have to try new things. I will stumble. I may fall.
Yeah.
And my expectation is that you're going to be there, helping me up, dusting me off, because that's exactly what I'm going to be doing for you.
Does that apply to a team level too? Or is that
Absolutely.
more, you see
Yeah.
teams doing that and building trust in that way as well?
So for teams, it's, each of these conversations has a little bit of different nuance, right? Individual relationships versus teams versus organizations. The model stays the same. But within a team, I can see if a team has high trust levels fairly quickly. It's, do they ask each other for help? Do they share resources? Yeah, help is the big one, right? We have a hard time asking for help, particularly guys, right? Men are worse at it than women are. We just are. Like, we struggle to ask for help. And it's why we're in such a ditch when it comes to loneliness. But, teams that are able to pull together and be collaborative just outperform other teams. It's so clear. The evidence is so clear. And all you got to do is watch when something goes wrong, right? Does the finger pointing start? Do they look around and say, oh, who's not in the room? That's the person to blame. So we'll start to see that in teams. Like, a good team has a shared narrative about what success looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody comes for one of them, they come for all of them. I was on a podcast with this ex-Navy SEAL, and he had this great line about benevolence. He said, in the SEALs, you're responsible for the success of the men next to you. And so if I'm on a team of 8 people, there are 7 people who are responsible for my success. And that's what a team looks like.
Right. So when I think about that notion of teams looking out for each other, this notion of interdependence, and I think when I got a chance to go through some of the work that you've done in your online course, that idea of interdependence kept coming up in my head.
Yeah.
So it seems like this notion of interdependence kind of exists in the whole construct of trust, not just in teams, but definitely there. Am I accurate about that?
You're absolutely right. And it goes back to vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
right? How are we vulnerable to each other? So if we're on a team together and you're being evaluated based on how the team does, you're vulnerable to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I don't pull my weight, then the team doesn't do as well.
It makes me think, I don't know if you ever saw that Netflix special. I don't know what it's called in English, but in Spanish it's called Casa de Papel. Maybe it's like Money Heist. But
Okay.
but one of the main characters said something towards the end of one season. He says, "We all win or we all lose." There was no in between.
Yeah.
That's what a trusting team, a vulnerable team, sounds like to me.
Yeah. You have shared goals and objectives. You don't have people trying to use each other for their own best. It's we before me.
I love that. That's how I feel about inclusion. So we're completely on the same page. It's a we thing, not a me thing. Yeah. So building trust in an uncertain world. Since your book was published, I would say the world is a little bit more uncertain. You just reinforced that.
Yeah.
I can go through the rest of the VUCA: volatile, complex, ambiguous, contentious, ideologically divided, confused, and flippant. Trust seems like it's just this fleeting idea that, that don't trust anybody. What would you say to those who feel like they can't trust anything or anyone?
So we can get stuck into this place where we think of trust as a dichotomous variable, right? Like, it's either present or absent. It's like an old time light switch. It's either flipped on or flipped off. Reality is we trust some people more than others. And if they truly trusted no one, they would never leave their house, right? So they would never go out to a restaurant. They would never cross the street when there's traffic. They wouldn't believe that anyone was going to obey the traffic laws. Like, that's a dysfunctional place for us to get. And we see that societies with lower trust levels, particularly parts of Eastern Europe, tend to perform much more poorly than those with higher trust levels. And it's because we have to verify everything, right? And so trust acts as a social lubricant. So I would say that we have lower trust levels, but we're not completely out yet.
Mm-hmm.
But we're definitely seeing signs of, there was a poll that I'm going to speak to soon on, I think it was on LinkedIn, said, do you trust the government? It didn't say what country, it just said, do you trust the government? And there were a little over 3,000 responses, 3,200 responses. 10% of people said yes. And
I wasn't one of those 10%.
right.
I trust the Swiss government, actually.
Fair enough.
But I don't necessarily always trust the government of the country I know best. It's ironically.
Right. And partly it's because of the incentive structures.
Mm-hmm.
And partly it's because there's uncertainty about how things are working.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at, politicians globally right now, the incentive structure seems off. Because when I talk to business leaders or other types of leaders, and I say to them, would you want to be a politician? Their response is, I would never put my family through that. Right? I don't want the abuse. I don't want the scrutiny. I don't want them to suffer. So a lot of politicians we have are fine with the people they love suffering so that they can be in positions of authority. Right?
That just reminds me, I was in my mid to late 30s. I still lived in Atlanta. I was before I moved to Boston and started working inside at Novartis. And I got approached by like 3 different people about running for office.
Right.
So they wanted me to run for state representative, and they were like pumping my head up. You could succeed, Congressman Lewis. And I was like, not Congressman Lewis is so fit and so, so I was like, no, I don't want to, those shoes are too big to fill. And
Right.
I don't want you digging into my whole life. I've done stuff. I don't want people, in it.
Oh,
So,
God, you've made mistakes?
Oh my God. Since this is going to be published,
race.
those are the things we'll do when we see each other in person. I'll tell you about that.
Right.
But, I didn't trust the system. I didn't trust that people would have my back. I knew that there's so much money in politics that's what most people were setting it up for. And I didn't even trust when some of the people that I knew and I had been friends with started asking me about it. I started losing my trust for them. Like, what are you trying to get out of this? Right. And I think they were sincere in retrospect, but it was still in my head. That brings me to this trust level is low. It has not seemed to get stronger for me in the past 10, 20 years. How can trust be built and maintained in the times we're in now?
Well, so I told you, I think it's a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability, right? And part of the challenge we're facing is that there's people actively heightening our sense of vulnerability, right? If you don't elect me, your country's going to hell, or we're all going to be out in the streets, or if this doesn't happen, then catastrophic.
Yeah, they will get you, or this will get you, et cetera. Yeah.
Right. And we're telling this remarkably negative story about each other. And we see how that plays out in places like Israel, right? This long-term negative story about each other leads us to engage in behavior that we would not recognize in ourselves. And that's a prequel to some of these other conflicts that are simmering. And so we need to be more intentional. We need to understand, where does uncertainty come from? And how do we take steps to reduce it? And how do we start to communicate more intentionally with each other? And so you and I had a brief conversation before we started recording about friendship, right? And we need to actually be having these more intentional conversations with one another so that we interpret the world through a shared narrative, not a splintered one. And, uncertainty comes from 2 places. It comes from us as individuals, and it comes from the context that we're embedded in. And to the extent that I'm able to explain my context to you, makes it easier for you to predict. Context is like the rules of the game, right? And so sometimes that will drive behavior patterns for me. And you need to know that I think you and I could be fantastic friends, but there's never going to come a time where I put your interests ahead of my son's. Right? If they desperately need me, I'm there. And if you and I were really close, you would understand that.
Sure.
And you would understand that I would show up for your kids too, because that's what I do for my friends. Right. And if you told me your kids were struggling with something, I'd be there. Because that's what a friend looks like to me.
That's what friends look like.
And so we need to understand, where does uncertainty come from? How do I take steps to explain myself better to you? And how do I include you in the conversation in a way that allows us to actually take steps and be transparent with each other? And so from the individual perspective, the 3 levers we can pull, I think of it in terms of 10 levers we can possibly pull. The 3 levers we can pull as individuals are benevolence, integrity, and ability. And benevolence is my favorite. It's having someone's best interest at heart, looking out for people. And when I ask a group of parents, I say, how many of you have your kids' best interest at heart? All the hands go up, right? But when I flip that question, I say, how many of your kids would say that? It's about a third, and it's somewhat hesitant. So, Omri, if it's not obvious in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, how do we make it obvious when you and I only connect a few times a month or every other month or whatever, right? Well, I actually include you in that conversation, right? Instead of guessing, I have the following conversation with you. I say, I know that benevolence really matters in trying to build trust with someone. And I've tried to act in people's best interest, but sometimes it doesn't land that way. Have you ever experienced that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so everyone has, right? And so we can start, it gets us thinking about, times when I tried to act in someone's best interest, it didn't go well or it landed flat. Have you ever had someone really have your back?
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't be here without it.
Yeah. And you talked about when you had hard times, your friends were there, right? And so now I've got you thinking about, what did it look like? Because I want to know, what did they do? What's an example of something somebody did to show you that they had your back? And now you're starting to give me hints. I'm starting to get a sense of what benevolence looks like for you. And then I can narrow the funnel further and I can say, what would it look like if I had your back? What does success look like for you? And how do I help you get there? And so now all of a sudden I've created this window of transparency where when later I reach out to you with something or I make a comment to you, I can say, you remember when you told me what mattered to you? Remember when you told me what success looked like? This is me trying to help you get there. And so there's not a danger.
So there's a certain amount of believing that somebody's thinking about you when you're not around. Like I don't have to wonder if they are considering me. And I'm not asking you to dote over me when I'm not around or even when I'm with you, but the way it occurs to me, what you're saying is, I'm considerate of you as part of my, for lack of a better word, circle of trust.
Yeah. And this is really powerful when we start to talk about kids. Because when my oldest turned 12, he looked at me one day and he said, Dad, I know you've always got my back.
Wow.
Even when you're upset with me, I know it's about what's best for me. And that's winning.
That's winning, brother. Mine is 4 years old. And if he ever says I've done something right.
Yeah. Right. And so it gives you so much grace because they have the best possible interpretation of your actions. Right. And so even when I talk to, my sons, when they were yours, when they were 4, they would try to figure out how to get what they wanted from the world. And one of the tactics was to have a tantrum, right? And I would sit down with them and I'd say, that never works with Dad. I want you to be successful in life. So you got to try something else. Because the harder you try this path, the more determined I become to never give in, right? And that's the integrity piece, right? That's that integrity lever. And I knew I was doing all right when my 6-year-old was sitting in the back seat beside my 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old started to have a full-on wobbly, and the 6-year-old said, yeah, that never works with me. So you're just wasting your energy.
I love it. I love it. He's schooling his little brother and probably carried them all the way to where they are today.
Well, that's the thing, is my sons have challenging moments and they've thrived. Right? And it's because of the model.
So, Darryl, I want to ask you something, and we've talked about this. You've one of the struggles that you've shared with me and been so generous to share is about your visual impairment.
Right.
And I can't think of something that makes one more vulnerable. There's not a lot of things that makes one more vulnerable, particularly a very visual person like me. To me, that when you told me that, it touched me because I'm like, I don't know how I would adjust to that. And now you also have a trusted partner that also has the name of a singer that I'm not a particular fan of, but I do like the name,
Right.
Drake. So can you tell me about how has your visual impairment, well, tell us a little bit about it, and then how has it shaped your conversation about trust after all these years
Right.
studying trust and then this emerging for you?
So, it's a good point you raise. I'm legally blind. I have something called cone dystrophy, which means that I'm missing just about all the cones in my eyes. And so I'm sensitive to light, struggle with details, anything, people ask me, can you see it all? I usually say I can see a couple of feet, but most of they're my own. If there's somebody else's, I'm probably in trouble. But I navigate the world with my guide dog, Drake. And it actually, I think, a different experience of the world than most people do. Because you're right, I need help often, right? I come to places I can get lost. I try to find items in places that I struggle. And my experience of the world is that people really want to be helpful, that we care about each other. And they love my guide dog, right? Because he's got such a positive story about everyone who approaches us. He just loves people. And they all assume he wants food, but he just fills up on affection, right? And so he brings people to us in a way that I didn't experience before I had.
Mhm.
And the practice of being vulnerable and accepting what comes has made me stronger. And I believe that we are all mildly afraid of being overly vulnerable. I got to tell you, the more you do it, the easier it gets and the stronger you become, right? There's this line from a Vin Diesel movie. I think he was the Knockaround Guys, where he was talking about being a tough guy. And he asks the other guy he's going to fight, he says, 200? The guy says, what are you talking about? He says, I thought it would take me 200 fights to become a tough guy. It toughens the skin, deadens the nerves. You learn things. I think there's a similar narrative here with being vulnerable. And I don't feel weak when I ask for help. And I don't feel self-conscious when I offer help to others.
Mm.
I feel like we're in this together. And I know one of the things that I've suggested is that if you have a friend who's struggling with mental health problems, who seems to be down, rather than offering help, ask for it. Because it makes them feel needed and it makes them see that it's okay to ask for help and that it's okay to be a little bit vulnerable. And so we model that for them. I had a student from the Ukraine when I was teaching in Luxembourg, and he said, well, any man who shows vulnerability is weak.
Mm.
And I said to him, I said, well, I'm 6'3", 240, 250 pounds. I used to play hockey, and if I need to, I can handle myself. And I said, would you like to step outside and see who's weak? He was like, well, no. I said, okay. So let's be clear. Being vulnerable, not weakness. It's actually strength.
Wow. Wow.
And it's that ability to say, I'm going to show you where I'm weak. And if you decide to stomp on it, then I know something about you.
Yeah.
And I know I need to be more careful moving forward. But if you take that and you show me compassion and care, then I've allowed you to be a little bit more vulnerable with me. And we can start this virtuous cycle together where we can connect.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Darryl, I'm out of questions. Well, I'm not. I have thousands more questions, but I don't have thousands of minutes more time.
Right.
Is there anything that I should have asked or that you'd like to add to this dialogue?
So a lot of times the barrier we run into, there's a couple things that get in the way of us building trust. One of those is the belief that we all believe we're more trustworthy than average. In fact, 95% of people, according to surveys, believe they're more trustworthy than average. And that's not just statistically impossible, it's problematic. Because if we run into a problem, then I'm assuming that you're the one that's responsible for it and you're doing the same thing and neither one of us is working on it. And so that's one thing that I'd like people to know. Another is that building trust is a skill that we can all get better at. And I try in my book and in my workshops and in my classes to really help people practice and apply these skills, to add them to their toolkit to help them get better at building deeper relationships.
Darryl, I want to thank you. Where can people find you? And we're going to put this in the show notes, but I just
Right.
want people to know where they can find Darryl Stickel and Dr. Darryl Stickel's work.
So they can find me at trustunlimited.com, and that's the name of my little company. There should be a link to I recently wrote the book, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World, where I try to lay out, I'm trying to scale, right? Like I'm having this massive impact, but it feels like I'm dropping grains of sand in the ocean. So if your listeners could come alongside, help me pick up some big rocks, that would be fantastic. And they can do that by joining me on LinkedIn and reacting and commenting on some of the content that I drop. It's usually fairly short, so it's not labor intensive. And if they want to read more stuff, they can check out the book. They can check out the masterclass, which I think I shared with you.
Mm-hmm.
And they can email me at darryl@trustunlimited.com.
Darryl, thank you. My audience thanks you. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.